Good day. Today is Monday, 12th January 2026. And before I proceed with this program, let me remind you again to tick the like button and check your subscription to this channel. If once you've watched the video or whatever part of the video you want to watch, you decide that you've liked what you've heard and you wish to indicate that fact. Now, as I did with my video yesterday, I'm going to begin today's video with a brief discussion of the situation in Iran. Now, over the weekend, the media in the West continued to report continued outbreaks of protests. There were many claims about immense violence taking place across the country. There were stories about hospitals filling up with wounded people who had been caught up in the protests and who had supposedly been attacked by the Iranian authorities. Anyway, there was an awful lot of that coverage. This despite the fact that there was an internet blackout and a very tight control of communications out of Iran. For the record, I happen to know that telephone calls, international telephone calls, both to and from Iran, were restricted as well. Just saying. Anyway, there was an awful lot of, despite the fact that almost by definition meant that the information flow from Iran was significantly reduced. In fact, was very slight. As I said, all of these confident claims about massive protests expanding across the country, taking place in more cities and towns, involving more and more people. They were all over the media over the weekend. This in sharp contrast to what the Iranian authorities were saying, which was that after a major spike in violence on Thursday night, a spike in violence that almost had about it the character of a violent insurrection. The situation thereafter rapidly stabilised, and that in most of the country the situation was calm. Well, I think this morning we now have clarity. It does increasingly appear, if what the Iranian authorities have been saying has indeed been correct, that the situation did indeed start to stabilise after the violence on Thursday night, and that the Iranian authorities this morning are in firm control of the entire country. In fact, there have been large demonstrations. There's been large numbers of people out in the streets in many cities across Iran, including Tehran itself, but they appear to be overwhelmingly government supporters who have been called out into the streets by the government itself as a sign of support for the government and the current political system. So, as of now, the situation appears to be under control. The Iranian Foreign Minister, Abbas Araghchi, has said as much. That is the reporting that I've seen from Iranian news sites, which are, of course, sympathetic to the government and in some cases directly controlled by the government, just to say. But to the best that I can see, that does appear to be the situation now. Of course, the internet blackout remains in place, though Foreign Minister Araghchi said that it would be relaxed and then dropped fairly soon, but of course he didn't give a timeline for that. And it is also the case that telephone communication with Iran appears to be restricted as well. The Iranian authorities, incidentally, say that they have been using the last couple of days to identify the various ringleaders of the various well, I won't say protest actions, the violent actions, many of which, as I said, did take place on Thursday. There's been a roundup of these people. This is again according to the Iranian authorities. The Iranian judicial authorities have also been speaking about the need to take decisive action to enforce law and order. And I have to say that I get the impression that what you might call assembly line justice is underway in various places across Iran, something which, by the way, let me make it absolutely clear, I strongly disapprove of. But anyway, what I think about it is really irrelevant to this affair. Anyway, rapid action, as I said, by the judicial authorities is being taken, and apparently we will start to see the first executions on Wednesday. At least that's some of the reports that I'm seeing, that some of the people who the Iranian authorities say they've captured and who were the ringleaders of the protests and who were instigated by Ukraine's adversaries in the West, enemies in the West, the United States, Israel, some European countries. The British government, by the way, has made no secret over the last 24 hours of its desire to see what it says is a peaceful transition of power away from the current government, which is, of course, an elegant way of saying that the British government wants to see a regime change in Iran. Anyway, I've no doubt, as I said, that these people probably were involved with these Western adversaries of Iran, but that is what the government is alleging, and some of them are going to be executed on Wednesday. Here I should say, by the way, and in passing, that I am an opponent of the death penalty. And again, to say that this causes me enormous personal discomfort would be a major understatement. But the key thing, as I said, is that the government appears to be in control, and that the streets are filled with its supporters, that its security forces appear to be functioning loyally and effectively on the ground, and that hopes or expectations or intentions by all sorts of parties in the United States, perhaps in Israel, certainly in Britain, in other places in Europe, to carry out that orderly transition of power, the regime change. For the moment, at least, it looks like they have entirely failed. Now, Arakshi has been making some comments. He says that Iran is prepared for war with the United States if war comes, but is nonetheless ready to conduct dialogue with the United States. Now, I ought to say that this has been a consistent Iranian policy. There was a period of time after the attack by the United States and Israel on Iran during the 12-day war that the Iranians basically said that they were not prepared to negotiate with the United States, specifically on the question of nuclear enrichment. But overall, Iran has always made it clear that it is prepared to have talks with the United States, and indeed with any country, apart from Israel, by the way, and that it's not refusing such talks. Anyway, President Trump appears to have seized on these words of Foreign Minister Arakshi, saying that the Iranians want a deal. He's talked about this in the past, by the way, and no doubt some kind of discussions between the United States and Iran will indeed take place over the next couple of days. Now, I ought to say that the Iranian government making a proposal for talks should be understood correctly. Coming after the events of the last 2 weeks, it is a sign of strength. It is an indicator of strength, and it is so intended to be. It is telling Trump and the Americans, look, we know what you were about. We know what you tried to do over the last 2 weeks. You have failed. We are still here. We have every intention of remaining here. Don't be under any illusions that we're going away or that we're going anywhere. If you do want to resolve your problems with us, then you need to talk to us. That is the message that Iran Arakchi, who is incidentally an extremely sophisticated political operator, Iran has an outstandingly good diplomatic and foreign affairs service. Anyway, that is the message that he and the Iranian authorities are conveying to the United States at this time. Now, I still remain of the view, nonetheless, that the United States, that Donald Trump, that the people who are gathered around him still want to achieve the fall of the Iranian government. And I remain firmly of the view that whatever negotiations take place between Iran and the United States now or over the next few weeks will lead nowhere, that American demands will be impossible for Iran to accept. The Iranians might also, by the way, start making counter demands of their own, which the United States is also not going to accept. And sooner or later, probably sooner rather than later, the attack on Iran is going to come. To repeat again the point I made in my program yesterday, there are two separate but parallel things taking place in Iran at this time. One is a protest, a series of protests that took place in Iran because of the difficult economic situation in Iran, which is partly caused by the American sanctions, but which is also, in my opinion, at least in part, also caused by the further economic mismanagement of President Pezeshkian's government, which comes on top of and takes further the chronic mismanagement of the Iranian economy that has been a characteristic of the government of Iran for at least a decade now, perhaps longer. So that is one current of events that has been taking place in Iran. The other is an attempted uprising instigated mostly, though not entirely, by outsiders, those outsiders being first and foremost the United States and Israel, which was intended to achieve regime change and which is intended to achieve the objective that was not achieved during the 12-day war, which, as I discussed in my program yesterday, was regime change. So these two events happening in parallel with each other do make this a somewhat confusing episode, and I think that they have led some people to assume that it is why either one or the other, either a genuine internal uprising or a pure externally instigated regime change operation, whereas it gives every sign of being both at the same time. But the point is that given that a regime change operation is underway, given what happened in June during the 12-day war, I personally have no doubt that the United States, that the Trump administration, sooner or later is going to return to the unfinished business of that regime change, regardless of what happens over the next few weeks, whatever discussions between Iran and the United States take place. There is no proposal, no concession that Iran can make that can satisfy the United States, and certainly not Israel, because their objective is regime change, and the Iranians by now overwhelmingly know it. So that inevitably, or so it seems to me, sets the scene for a further military showdown at some point over the next few weeks. Now, the only reason that there hasn't been a showdown this time, despite the fact that, as I said, events have closely tracked the well-established narrative that happens in advance of regime change operations in many countries, protests, reports of extreme violence by the government authorities, by the security services. We saw that in Ukraine, in Syria, in Libya, probably hugely inflated claims about the numbers of people killed by the security services during the protests, massive criticism in the West of the security services and of the government in question, eventually evolving into demands from Western governments that the authorities cease to take the steps that they are taking and allow the protests, which are invariably misdescribed as peaceful, to take their natural course being, of course, the overthrow of the government. Anyway, demands that the authorities allow the protests, as I said, to take their course. Threats that if that doesn't happen, military action will follow, and then eventual action to achieve that effect, unless the government, like, say, the Ukrainian government in 2014, President Yanukovych's government, does the thing that the West wants, which is effectively to step aside and to let the protests take their course and to let itself be overthrown. Anyway, eventual military action to overthrow the government itself. Military action, either directly, as in Libya, or by proxy, as in Syria. Anyway, despite the fact that that narrative is already being shaped, that we saw it develop to a certain extent over the last 2 weeks, it does seem that for the moment the United States has decided that it is not in a position to follow through to the last part of this narrative, which is, of course, the military attack. And I think the reason for this is not difficult to understand, which is that what has become increasingly clear over the last 12 months is that there are structural imbalances, I'm not going to say divisions, imbalances within the United States government. So, on the one hand, the Pentagon, which is never, it must be said, massively supportive of these regime change operations, is complaining that it is not ready. There are no U.S. carrier groups close to Iran at the present time. The military bases, the American military bases in the Arab Gulf states have not been readied for military action. There's worries about what counter-action the Iranians might take. We saw during the 12-day war that the Iranians absolutely do have the means to strike back and to hit hard, both at the Israelis and at the Americans, should they choose to do so. So the military, the U.S. military, was not ready to act on any presidential order to conduct a major military operation against Iran. But the CIA, the intelligence agencies, the various security services, the covert operators, the people in Iran who no doubt have some connection to the Israeli intelligence community as well, they have been moving according to their own timetable. And the result is that there was a disjunction between the two. The protests happened too early. The violence on Thursday took place before the United States was fully in a position to take advantage of it. And that, I think, is the only thing materially that has delayed the attack, which I am confident will come. Just saying. So, probably we will see discussions, negotiations take place between Iran and the United States. There's a chance, perhaps, that they might lead to some outcome. But it seems to me much more likely that both sides will understand that a military showdown is indeed coming, and steps will be taken by each side to move the various pieces, the various military assets, into position so that they are ready for when the clash comes. So, over the next few weeks, if reports start to circulate that the United States is indeed moving carrier groups towards the Persian Gulf, if we see American aircraft taking positions in the Arabian Peninsula, then, as I said, it seems to me that there's a high likelihood of some kind of a military clash coming, and it would be a clear sign of this. On the Iranian side, what the Iranian authorities will probably want to prioritize now is the re-establishment of some degree of internal stability within Iran itself. And I suspect that we will be seeing a stronger security force presence in Iranian cities over the next few weeks and months, even as the Iranian military itself makes whatever preparations it can make at this particular time. Now, I'm just going to say this. There is some evidence, it's very inferential, I mean, I don't know this for a fact, that Iran is now starting to get assistance from its BRICS partners, that it has sought and has obtained assistance with its BRICS partners. I've already discussed in previous programs that the extent and sophistication both of the internet blackout and of the block on telephone contacts, other contacts with Iran, does suggest to me that the Iranian authorities are indeed receiving some degree of advice and assistance from their two key BRICS partners, China and Russia. One should not underestimate Iran's own sophistication or its own capabilities. Iran is in some ways a very sophisticated society, but I have to say that when there have been protests of this sort in the past, I have never known the Iranian authorities to respond in such an effective way where control of the information is concerned. They've never imposed an internet blackout so thoroughly and so completely. And that does look to me like a major upgrade, and it's exactly the kind of thing you would expect both the Chinese and the Russians to have been able to help Iran with. But it also seems to me that Iran must do much more. Now, I've already discussed how the protests, the original protests, undoubtedly are connected to the difficult economic situation in Iran, given that maintaining domestic stability needs to be the priority. It seems to me that Iran needs to take urgent steps to stabilize the currency. And this should not be difficult. Probably Iran domestically does not have the resources to do that, but its two big BRICS partners, China and Russia, undoubtedly do. Iran's economy, it's a big country, but Iran's economy, relatively speaking, in GDP terms, is relatively small. The number of people who trade in the rial, the Iranian currency, at any one time, must be either relatively few in number or able to afford relatively little in buying and selling it. So here, the Russians, with their big reserves, and far more so the Chinese, with their all but infinite reserves, can easily step in and help Iran to stabilize the rial, the currency, which I suspect would return a degree of financial stability to the country. To repeat again a point I made in my program yesterday, when there were problems with the peso, the Argentinian currency, President Milei of Argentina did not hesitate to call on his American friends, Donald Trump and Scott Bessent, to help him out. And they did help him out, and it stabilized the situation in Argentina sufficiently to enable Milei to win a parliamentary election. It seems to me that there is absolutely nothing that prevents the Iranians from doing the same thing. Going to China, which has just made statements saying that it wants to see internal stability preserved in Iran, there is absolutely nothing to prevent President Pezeshkian and his officials, including the new central bank chair, from contacting the Chinese and asking them for a couple of $1 billion worth of currency so that they can stabilize the rial. Obviously, the money will come with strings attached, and there might be some degree of economic reforms or economic changes that the Chinese insist upon. But given, as I said, that many of the problems in the Iranian economy strike me as being the product of mismanagement, probably if the Chinese do make such demands, it would be no bad thing, and it might actually help to stabilize the economy of Iran in the long term. I don't know whether the Iranians will do this. They have shown a massive aversion to borrowing in the past. I can completely understand why they would not want to borrow from the West, and in fact it would be incredibly dangerous for them to do that. But they are now a member of BRICS. There are the various BRICS financial institutions that can be used to arrange this loan. There is, as I said, always the option of a direct call to China, to Xi Jinping himself, or to other Chinese officials. The sums of money that would be needed to achieve the stabilization, the economic stabilization for China, would be almost absurdly small. So there is no reason why Iran should not do it. I think they absolutely do need to do it. They should not worry too much about what strings any loan from China or any agreement by China to start buying reals would cause. As I said, the Iranians can do it. And I think that if it happened, if there was a return to financial stability, if inflation, the heat began to come off the inflation burner, then, as I said, a lot of things, a lot of the problems and stresses within Iran, which have made the situation look so fragile, anyway, a lot of those things would begin very rapidly to abate. And that would put the Iranians in a much stronger position, both to negotiate with the Americans, if there is going to be any serious talks or negotiations at all, but also it'll put the Iranians in a better position if a conflict, a military conflict with Israel and the United States does indeed come. Now, of course, there's a lot more that the Iranian authorities need to do in terms of military preparations and all of that. They must not let themselves, one would assume, fall into the trap they fell into back in June, when they completely disregarded the extensive reporting and commentaries that were all over the U.S. media that spoke of an imminent Israeli attack on Iran on the eve of the 12-day war. The Iranian authorities must not make that mistake again, thinking that negotiations with the United States provide some kind of shield against an attack whilst the negotiations are underway. The events in June obviously showed the foolishness of that assumption. The Iranians need to make the necessary military preparations in terms of getting their ballistic missile arsenals organized and dispersing their leaders and hardening up their positions and doing that kind of thing. But these are technical matters which I don't feel able to discuss, and anyway, it's not the kind of thing I feel able to or indeed comfortable giving advice about. So anyway, that is where we are. Perhaps above all, Iranian leaders, President Pezeshkian in particular, need to understand that this is a crisis that is for the duration. There is no way, in my opinion, that it can be resolved through negotiations, given, as I said, that the objective in Washington and Israel continues to be regime change. There is no concession that Iran can ever make that will satisfy the Americans and the Israelis, given that that is the case. And obviously, negotiations, even in such a circumstance, can serve useful purposes for a country that finds itself in Iran's position. But they should not be used as an excuse for not doing the necessary things that Iran needs to do in order to protect itself. Anyway, that's what I'm going to say about the situation in Iran at the moment. I will say something further about the United States and about the situation within the Trump administration. It does seem to me that, as is always the way, the Trump administration is rapidly becoming a kind of court in which various factions compete for the president's ear. This is true, by the way, of every single administration that I can remember, stretching all the way back to Lyndon Johnson's. Perhaps the only one that was a sort of exception was Richard Nixon's, because Nixon and Kissinger formed such a tight team that there was no real way to get round them, and one could get a fairly good idea of what the foreign policy was at any one time by listening to what Kissinger in particular was saying. But every other administration, it seems to me, always at some level breaks down into various different competing factions. In the case of the Trump administration, this is particularly the case, and we have the further added problem that in charge is a man, the President of the United States, who recognizes no constraints on his behavior, whether these be from international law or domestic law or any such things, or conventional ideas of power politics or whatever. The only constraint on his behavior that he recognizes, as he recently admitted in an interview he gave to the U.S. media, is his own morality, which is to say his conscience. Now that was already bad enough, but this person, the President of the United States, seems to me to have a disastrous tendency to follow the advice of the last person he speaks to. This is a point recently made also very forcefully by my colleague and friend Alex Christoforou. And this same person, the President of the United States, Donald Trump, also has a disastrous tendency to resort to the most extreme and ruthless measures. So he played, as I think now is impossible to deny, an extremely duplicitous game with the Iranians back in June, pretending to negotiate with them, even as he was conspiring with Prime Minister Netanyahu and the Israelis for an Israeli attack to be made against Iran, aimed at murdering or killing many of the Iranian leaders. Something similar happened a few months later when a Hamas delegation was attacked in Qatar. We've had the bizarre story recently of the drone attack on Putin's Valdai residence, which I'm going to come to later in this program, but which also, I'm sorry to say, is starting to look as if it might fit into this pattern. And we have also had, of course, the abduction, capture, kidnapping, call it whatever you want, of Nicolas Maduro, the president of Venezuela. You might call it the Corleone School of Diplomacy, acting on the principles set out in the movies The Godfather. I mean, it has that incredible sense about it. And the President of the United States seems to have a proclivity for this sort of thing. And he seems to have some people in the CIA and the intelligence community who are absolutely happy to go along with these kind of disastrous ideas and perhaps even suggest them to the president. And so the president seems to listen to these people, and other people who might act as restraints upon him are frozen out. So we're now told, and I believe this to be true, that Tulsi Gabbard, who happens to be the Director of National Intelligence in the United States, was completely frozen out of all of the discussions and plotting and preparation on the eve of the operation to abduct Maduro from Venezuela. She was on holiday in Hawaii at the time. Nobody apparently told her that this was being prepared. She was not kept informed. I mean, it's astonishing that the president should treat his own director of national intelligence in that way, but that is apparently what happened. And I get the sense also that the vice president, J.D. Vance, who is working overtime to give the sense, to convey the impression of total loyalty to the president, and does so, by the way, achieves that with some skill. Anyway, I get the sense that J.D. Vance also is largely frozen out of many of these discussions. And obviously this creates disjunction. This partially explains why the CIA is doing one thing and the Pentagon is doing something completely different. And it also makes it even more difficult for another party, Iran, for example, in this case, to have any hope that negotiations with this president, with his team, are going to lead anywhere. So the Iranians need to take all of that into account, as, by the way, does the rest of the world. And now that brings me to one of the most important governments, which is the government of Russia. Now, I have spoken in many programs now, several programs now, about the prolonged disappearance over the New Year and Christmas holidays of the president of Russia, Vladimir Putin. Now, Putin, as I said already, does deserve a rest and a holiday. He's had an extremely intense and busy 2025, and December 2025 was especially intense and busy. He does need, some would say he deserves, a break. Having said this, I have followed Putin closely for many years now, and he does take breaks, but even during those breaks, he does sometimes take time off to deal with pressing and important matters. So he didn't really, over the 12 or so days during which he basically disappeared from the scene. He did have a brief meeting with a security official in which he was apparently provided with a report about the Ukrainian attack, drone attack on a hotel in Kherson region. But we've had nothing more about that since then. He attended a church service. He spoke to a 7-year-old boy by telephone who'd participated in a charity event. But basically, there's been almost nothing else. He's had no contacts whatsoever with foreign leaders, or at least not that we know of. After Maduro's abduction, one might have expected him to call and speak to the new interim president of Venezuela, Delcy Rodriguez. After all, this is a big event. Maduro was somebody that Putin himself knew very well. He's taken an interest in the past in Venezuela. The abduction of Maduro was an extraordinary event. I would have expected, even if Putin was on holiday, that he would come out of his holiday and be the person to speak to Delcy Gonzalez, and I imagine that that was what the Venezuelans at least might have expected him to do. Instead, the call was between Delcy Gonzalez and the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov. It was almost as if Lavrov was standing in for Putin during this period. And there's been comments, obviously, by Lavrov. There's been an extraordinarily tough statement by the Foreign Ministry about the disastrous meeting of the so-called Coalition of the Willing in Paris, where all sorts of appalling ideas about security guarantees for Ukraine and deployment of European forces in Ukraine were floated. The Russian Foreign Ministry responded to all of that with an incredibly tough statement. But again, no word from Putin. And Medvedev has been busy. He's been making statements of his own. He's been talking about how the Western powers are talking about a war with Russia, how the Europeans seem to be keen on a war with Russia, which is what this business about sending European troops to Ukraine seems to be all about. And Medvedev has basically said, bring it on. And Medvedev has also, by the way, given his own view of the Marinera incident. He's spoken about how it was opportunistic and inappropriate for the ship owner of this particular ship to reflag his ship after the Americans had already announced plans for its seizure, and that stressing that this should never happen again, and that in future, basically the implication was that in future, if you want the protection of Russia, then you should arrange for it in advance, not after the Americans are already coming for you, which is basically the point I've been making in previous programs where I've discussed the incident of the Marinera. So anyway, all of these officials have been speaking, but Putin himself has been basically nowhere to be seen. He did resurface today, and he was back as normal. He had a long discussion with the Russian Deputy Prime Minister, Denis Manturov. Manturov informed him about the situation in the manufacturing side of the economy, which continues to expand. They had a very detailed discussion about the situation in the defense industries. There was discussions about the space program. It was all very interesting. It was classic Putin. It was the first real meeting that Putin has had with a senior Russian official now for, well, more than 2 weeks. Now, I don't believe that Vladimir Putin takes a total holiday for a period as long as 2 weeks. I have followed him, as I said, very closely, and that just does not seem to me to be in character with the man. And I believe, and I think all of the indications essentially confirm this, that Putin and his top officials have taken advantage of the Christmas and New Year holiday to conduct an in-depth discussion with each other about relations with the United States and about the diplomacy connected to the war in Ukraine. And I think that the general consensus is that the agreements that Putin and Trump reached or thought they had reached, or the Russians thought they had reached in Anchorage, are obviously never going to be translated into serious action. That the Americans, Trump himself, have at various times talked about delivering Tomahawk missiles to Ukraine, imposed sanctions on Rosneft and Lukoil, are talking about imposing further sanctions on Russia again, are discussing a vote this week on the Lindsey Graham, Richard Blumenthal bone-crushing sanctions bill, and perhaps most disastrous of all was that drone attack on the Putin residence in Valdai, the presidential residence in Valdai. And, well, the Russians, I have no doubt, believe that this was an attempted attack, assassination, on Putin himself. They waited to see how the Americans would react. Trump initially said that he was shocked and horrified. He then walked it all back after speaking to CIA Director Radcliffe. He said that the Ukrainians did conduct an attack on Novgorod, but it wasn't on the Valdai residence, but instead on some other undisclosed military installation somewhere close to the Valdai residence. They've never ever told us what that facility was. I don't think the Russians take any of these denials seriously. They have seen the articles that have appeared in the American media. They've seen how those articles openly, straightforwardly acknowledged that the American CIA, has been playing an active, even directing role in Ukraine's drone offensive against Russia. And they must be asking themselves, in light of the behavior of Donald Trump, his pursuit of what I call the Corleone school of diplomacy, whether Trump perhaps did have some role to play in this attack on Valdai, whether in fact the Americans knew all about this, whether it was an assassination attempt, and whether Trump himself was involved. Like my friend and colleague Alex Christoforou, I balk at the idea that the President of the United States would do such a thing. The idea just so appalls me that the President of the United States would be party to an assassination attempt of the President of Russia, that I still can't quite believe that it is true. However, we do have to bear in mind all of the other things that happened over the course of 2025. The duplicity in advance of the attempted assassination on the first day of the 12-day war of the Iranian leaders, the attack on the Hamas delegation in Qatar, the abduction of Maduro. It does seem as if some kind of pattern is starting to emerge. One needs to be careful about patterns, because patterns are often visible purely to the eye of the beholder. They might not exist in fact, and with a government as disorganized and as chaotic and as fragmented as the current American government is, well, as I said, it may be that there's more than one actor involved, and there's still an outside possibility, of course, that the Americans weren't involved at all. But what I think, whatever doubts I have, really don't matter. It's what the Russians themselves must be thinking, what they are saying to each other. And I cannot help but think that there are people taking Putin aside, talking to him over the course of the last 2 weeks, telling Putin, look, this president who you are negotiating with, you've been holding talks with, this president you met in Anchorage, the man who took back all of the concessions he appeared to have made in Anchorage, who has been talking about sending Tomahawk missiles to Ukraine, who has been sanctioning our oil companies, attempting to seize our tankers, assisting the drone attacks on our refineries and our tankers, even as he pretends to negotiate with us, is probably the same man who ordered the attack on you that took place, even as he was pretending to speak. This man was pretending to speak with your major adversary, President Zelensky of Ukraine. Is this really someone you want to continue to negotiate with? Putin, after all, did tell Trump over the course of their last call, when Putin complained about the attack on Valdai, that the Russians, in light of the attack, would reconsider some of the previous concessions that they had made over the course of the discussions between Russia and the United States. And I fully expect that when we start to see more statements coming out of Moscow over the next few weeks, what we're going to find is that the Russian position has significantly hardened. Not just hardened a little, but hardened a lot. And we're starting to get signs of this. Now, in my program yesterday, I discussed how I had been informed by a source that the word in Russia was that the Oreshnik strike that had happened on the city of Lvov was intended to destroy some sort of command base located in a aircraft facility, some kind of a military base facility in Lvov itself, which refurbished and produced drones, some of which might have been drones of the sort that were used in the attack on the Valdai residence. Well, just a few hours later, what I was told in an email has been confirmed publicly by the Russian Ministry of Defense. And this is the statement the Russian Ministry of Defense has just given. According to information confirmed by several independent sources, a strike launched by the armed forces of the Russian Federation on the night of 9th January using the Oreshnik mobile ground-based missile system disabled the Lvov State Aviation Repair Plant. At the plant, aircraft of the armed forces of Ukraine, including F-16s and MiG-29s, supplied by Western countries, were repaired and maintained. So it looks like some of these aircraft, F-16s and MiG-29s, were destroyed in this factory. Just to say, that's one thing that happened. And then, which exactly corroborates what my source told me, the plant also produced long-range and medium-range attack drones used to hit Russian civilian facilities in the depths of Russian territory. The Oreshnik engaged production workshops, warehouses with drones, as well as the infrastructure of the factory airfield. In addition, as part of this massive attack with the use of the Iskander missile system and the Calibre C-based cruise missiles, the production facilities of two enterprises in Kiev involved in assembling strike drones for attacks against the territory of Russia, as well as energy infrastructure facilities that support the work of the Ukrainian defense industry were hit. So the factory involved, the base involved, was a repair facility. It was also an air base, by the way, where MiG-29s and F-16s were refurbished. That was something that open sources were saying. It was also a place where drones, long-range and medium-range drones, used to hit Russian civilian facilities in the depth of Russian territory were produced. That is exactly what my source told me. He also told me that many of these drones are actually mostly fabricated in Europe. They are sent to this facility in Lvov to be completed there, to preserve the fiction that they're actually made in Ukraine. So they're funneled through this facility. And the Russians don't say that there was a command post also located in this facility, but that is what my source told me. And given that the information the Defense Ministry is providing corroborates other things that he has said, I have no reason to doubt that this command facility was also attacked as well. So there we are. Now, given what is being described here, given the nature of the attack, again, I can't help but think that this was a signal of a more aggressive posture by Russia, not just against Ukraine, but also against the United States. And we have had more drone footage of Odessa and of the harbour of Odessa, which, remember, is now Ukraine's basically only functioning port, and it effectively confirms that Odessa is now under blockade. The Russians have produced footage of two, perhaps one, perhaps it's the same merchant ship, being attacked by drones in the port of Odessa itself, perhaps on the high seas. I believe it's two ships, though, to be honest, it's always difficult to say exactly. But clearly now, any ship owner knows that if they send their ships, their merchant ships to Odessa, there is a high probability that the Russians will attack them. So Odessa now is, as far as I can see, under effective blockade, just to say. And this, I suspect, sets the pattern for what is going to happen over the course of the next year. Now, there's been further information about the military situation. It builds on many of the things I've been saying over the last couple of days. The Russian Defense Ministry has given more information about the situation in Kupiansk. It says that the Ukrainians made a somewhat farcical attempt, apparently, to try to plant a drone on the main administration building in Kupiansk itself, but that this was unsuccessful. And they say that, well, I'll give the statement itself. Being unable to break into the city of Kupiansk, the Ukrainian military attempted to mark its alleged presence in the city by means of a drone, which intended to set up a Ukrainian flag on the city administration building. Both flag and drone were neutralized. And by the way, on the topic of Kupiansk, it seems that the Russians are now on the brink of attacking the outlying suburb of Kupiansk, Kuzlovoy, tightening the noose around the Ukrainian troops who are apparently encircled east of Kupiansk. I suspect that the battle there is coming to an end. But perhaps more interesting, more informative over the last 24 hours is that the Russians appear to have made further advances south of Zaporozhzhye city. They apparently are on the brink of fully capturing the big village of Primorske, which lies on the Dnieper River, the east bank of the Dnieper River, south of Zaporozhye city. And it seems that the forward positions of the Russian army are now located around 10 kilometers south of Zaporozhye city itself. And there are reports that the Ukrainian authorities are evacuating civilians from Zaporozhye, from the southern suburbs of Zaporozhye city, which suggests that the fighting there is about to intensify. Now, it's been pointed out to me that the conditions in Ukraine are becoming colder. This, of course, deepens the humanitarian crisis that we have in the cities where there is no power. But it means a number of other things. It means that the batteries of some drones probably don't work very well in the extreme cold. I suspect Russian drones perhaps better adapted. Anyway, that's only a guess. There are also reports that the rivers will freeze. There's some talk about the Dnieper freezing, and no doubt that is true. And no doubt in some of the shallower areas of the Dnieper, such as you find in the central Dnieper area, that will make it more fordable. But perhaps more importantly, some of the smaller rivers will also soon start to freeze. And given that it's the Russians who are on the offensive and it is the Ukrainians who are using the rivers as obstacles, that might make crossing of the rivers by the Russians easier. In any event, my own sense is that with the ground hardening, with it being perhaps more difficult for Ukraine to use its drones, and with perhaps some of the rivers across Ukraine freezing over, making them more fordable, there is at least a possibility, in fact there's a strong likelihood, that the Russian advance will begin to accelerate, gain momentum from this point on. And going back to what I said about the Oreshnik attack, the fact that the confirmation from the Russian Defense Ministry essentially corroborates what I was told by the source about the nature of the target that was attacked. Well, I see no reason to doubt that the rest of what the source said was true, that there is greater demands from within the Duma for the reserve armies to be committed to the battle. My guess is that at some point within the next few months they will be. That will certainly change the dynamic of the war, with many, many more Russian forces joining in the campaign in Ukraine. And, well, we will see where that leads. Now, I'm going to finish today's program by returning to a topic that I've discussed recently, which is the topic of Greenland. And my point that the policy of European governments sacrificing, in effect, Greenland to Trump, there's no doubt at all to my mind that we are going to see increasing pressure on Denmark to come to an agreement with Trump, which basically hands over Greenland to the United States, that this amounts, in effect, to appeasement. Now, this amounts to appeasement in the classical sense of the way in which that term is used to describe the policies that the British and the French governments of Neville Chamberlain and Daladier at the Munich conference in 1938. I made the point that diplomatic interaction with the Russians to try to resolve the conflict in Ukraine is in no sense appeasement, whereas the policy that the British and the French governments, the Western, European governments, seem about to take, basically pressuring or even bullying a small country, Denmark, which it is important to remember is their ally. Ukraine is not an ally of France or Britain or of any European or of any NATO state. Ukraine is outside NATO, whereas Denmark is both a member of the European Union and a member of NATO. That bears much closer parallels. The pressuring Denmark to give up Greenland is much more similar to the kind of pressure that was applied against Czechoslovakia to surrender the Sudetenland than anything that we are seeing in the diplomacy between Russia and the European powers at the present time. Perhaps at this point, I should nonetheless make it absolutely clear that I don't see any real similarities at all between the government of Germany in the 1930s and the current government of the United States, though I do know that some people draw parallels which I don't think apply. But I'm talking about appeasement as a policy. It has seemed to me, that this is an accurate description of European policy with respect to Greenland and Donald Trump. Now, no European government says this, and I have not seen a single article in any part of the European media, certainly not the British media, that says this either. But one government is indeed saying this, and it is doing so through one of its media outlets. The government in question is the government of China, and its media outlet is Global Times, which, as I have discussed many times, is a newspaper which publishes mostly in English, which is, however, owned by the People's Daily, which is the official newspaper of the Communist Party of China, which means that, in effect, Global Times must be seen on international relations as the voice of the Chinese government. Anyway, Global Times has published an editorial about the Greenland issue, and not just the Greenland issue, but about European policy towards Trump's America. And I notice that it has no hesitation at all in using the word Greenland. Sorry, we're using the word appeasement. And The title of the article is Faced with Hegemonic Coercion, Europe can no longer pretend to be asleep. And it begins, Europe is facing a soul-searching question regarding the future of Greenland. Should it compromise with hegemonic requests or firmly defend its own sovereignty, interests and international rules? Just as the European version of Politico said, if European governments didn't realize before that Donald Trump's threats to seize Greenland were serious, they do now. And the article, the editorial, I should say, continues, faced with the rise of hegemonism and unilateralism. This is how Global Times describes the policies of the Trump administration. Europe has exhibited hesitation and indecisiveness. This stems primarily from two illusions. First, it hinges on the hope that the United States will be better if a different party takes over. Second, it holds a wishful thinking that Europe will not become the next target of bullying. This mentality reveals a harsh reality. Europe feels powerless to cope with various changes alone, and therefore regards its strategic relationship with the United States as a higher priority that must be carefully maintained. Consequently, some attempt to exchange compromises of principle for the preservation of their so-called core interests in the face of the behavior, the hegemonic behavior. And then the article, the editorial says, this is typical appeasement mentality, fantasizing about pacifying powerful forces through aggression, through concessions. Preserving Greenland and preserving the NATO alliance to ensure security are not a one or the other choice for Europe. Greenland's status as a key node in the transatlantic shipping route and a core area for Arctic resource development means that if it falls into U.S. control, Europe will completely lose its voice in Arctic affairs. From coercing countries to increase NATO military spending and abandon energy cooperation with Russia, to forcing Europe to comply with US trade sanctions against China, the more Europe appeases hegemony, the more the hegemon will take advantage of it, thus accelerating the binding of Europe itself firmly to the hegemon and turning it into the hegemon's pawn in the geopolitical game. What Europe truly needs to ask itself is this: as a key pole in the multipolar world, how should Europe define itself? And then the article goes on to say, correctly as it happens, that in theory at least, Europe has many cards to play. It is still a big bloc economically. It still has technological and industrial resources. It still has significant cultural power. But if it continues to pursue this policy of appeasement, it will lose all of these things and its own ultimate sovereignty and freedom of action. Now, that is absolutely correct. It shows again what a clear-eyed government currently China has. One doesn't need to like the Chinese government or to approve of all of the things it does in order to see that. This level of insight is not to be found anywhere in Europe at this time. one can sense behind this article also, this editorial also, a sense of bafflement and frustration on the part of the government in Beijing that the European states should be behaving in this pusillanimous way, that they should be so obsessively and narrowly focused on their conflict with Russia that they feel that they must appease the United States, Trump's United States, in every regard. Anatol Lieven, in Responsible Statecraft, made a similar point. He said that Europe's, because of the crisis in Ukraine and because of the stance the European states are taking relative to this crisis, Europe's dependence on the United States has reached such colossal levels that effectively the only policy that Europe has towards Trump's United States is appeasement, though I should stress that Anatol Lieven doesn't use that word, and perhaps he might disagree with my doing so. But I do think that that is the correct word to describe what he is describing in his article. Just saying. So there it is. We are in a situation of appeasement in Europe. I was watching recently the British Prime Minister Keir Starmer address the House of Commons, and he was talking about his plan to send troops to Ukraine, one which incidentally did not seem to attract huge amount of support within the British Parliament. I noticed that there was considerable protest against it from various MPs and very few supportive cheers, just to say. But again, I noticed also that over the course of this speech, this address to the British Parliament, Keir Starmer came under pressure from various British MPs to say something about the policies of the United States with respect to Venezuela, but most specifically with respect to the issue of Greenland. And again, he completely funked the opportunity. In fact, he complained that he was being asked to make a choice between loyalty to NATO and loyalty to the alliance with the United States. He seemed to feel that he should not even be asked these questions, even though the question is not so much loyalty to NATO as such, but loyalty to an ally, a historic ally of Britain, namely Denmark, with which Britain has had a very, very long and friendly relationship. I would add that the British and Danish royal families are related to each other. Anyway, Starmer would not criticise or push back against the United States in any way. He didn't utter a single word of criticism of Donald Trump. He seemed absolutely fixated with his grandiose plan to send European troops to Ukraine, oblivious to the fact that the Russians had already categorically and many times rejected his proposal. I have to say that in his combination of complacency, self-belief, ability to come across as supremely pleased with himself, dismissal of his critics, refusal to address his concerns, he looked to me more like Neville Chamberlain, with whom with whose history I am very familiar. And of course, I'm also familiar from newsreels of him. He looked to me more like Neville Chamberlain than any British Prime Minister that I can remember. Starmer may imagine that with respect to Russia, he is behaving like Churchill, but it is like Churchill's predecessor that he seems to me much more like. Just say. To repeat again, I don't think there is any similarity, any true similarity between the current government of the United States or the government in Germany that existed in the 1930s, which Chamberlain and Churchill had to contend with. In that respect, today's folly is not remotely close to what was true then. But anyway, that's what I thought. Appeasement is the word I will continue to use, and I do think it is striking and interesting that the Chinese government, looking at all of this, thinks the same as me. Anyway, this is where I'm going to finish today's program. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble, and X, as well as Substack. Please remember you can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, and by going to our shop, links under this video. Last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.